when I came up to Amherst to teach, standing on a hill with Professor Bracy, and we were talking about the future of Black studies in the 5 college area. And we both looked at each other and we said, and in order for it to live and stay alive, we've got to have a graduate program. I shall never forget that. And that is why to this day you walk into a place that's here at the University of Massachusetts, and it is alive and living and thriving. I kept thinking, I'm just teaching Black literature, but that's not true. I was teaching the sociology of Black literature, the politics of Black literature, the humanity of Black literature. I was teaching all of that. That movement that came about in Black studies and the Black arts movement was a movement where we got on stages that we were equals. I remember when Barack and I went to a place called San Francisco to begin Black studies. I was hired as a professor. Brother Amidi Baraka was hired as the person who would do the cultural thing. When we first got there, Brother Barack and I gave a reading because we wanted to get all the Black and students of color to come and meet during the day. We chose a Wednesday. We said, well, how can we get them to come? And someone said, one of the sisters in the BSU said, let's cook up, let's get some food. And we got crowds of people because we fed them. Students are always hungry. So we had all this food. And then after we fed them, they sat down with, and they were eating the dessert, the cake. Barack and I got up on stage. And, we come from the East. So we got up on stage and we start reading. And then we finished. And then people clapped. And then a hand went up and said, Professor Sanchez, Mr. Jones, because he was still Leroy Jones at the time, Mr. Jones, could you do that again? Because we didn't quite understand you. You were reading too fast. And Barack and I looked at each other and we did the whole reading, moving at a slower pace. We are forever indebted to rap, are we not? Because rap has taken that fast staccato reading, poetry, rap all over the country. So if we go to Oshkosh, Wisconsin, someplace, people can understand us because they have heard rap. Barack being downtown on a Sunday and hearing the word that Malcolm had been assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom, and he would leave the bookstore and say, I'm going to move up to Harlem because we're going to continue Malcolm's work up in a place called Harlem. And he will send letters to all of the artists, right? Saying the musicians, the composers, right? The writers, the playwrights, to come and join me and us, at BART, the Black Arts Repertory Theater. We are going to continue Brother Malcolm's work. And that's what we tried to do. And on Saturday nights and Friday nights, I'm telling you, Harlem was outside that house. People lined up. We had to do 2 shows for people to come in and hear the musicians come in and play what they had to play. It was Harlem became holy again. You cannot remember that period, without understanding that we looked up like we looked up 4 years ago, and understand and saw people who did not mean us any good in the White House, and running the world, running the country. And we had to identify who they were, so you couldn't say, well, look at those guys up there doing that damage, right? You had to call them what they were. And we certainly did do that. It was in Pittsburgh there in 1969 when I left out of San Francisco State that, I taught the first course in America called The Black Woman. Can you imagine that? Whoa. And you would think that came from me. No. I mean, I figured out the course, but I had all these Black women who always gathered into my office. And one night I said, it's 8 o'clock. I got to get home to my children. I got to eat. I'm tired. I got to grade papers. And I said, sometimes I think we need a course. on you sisters. But I was saying it in a facetious kind of way. I locked the door, said good night. They went back to their dorms. I went home, and did all the work that you have to do when you get home. And I showed back up in my office. I can still see myself getting back in the office at 8 o'clock before my class, right? And as I put the key in the door, there were 20 Black women lined up outside my door. And I said, "Woo, what are you people doing here?" And they crowded into my small office. And they said, "You're right, Professor Sanchez, we need a course." I said, yeah, of course. What are we going to call it? Black women? And they said, yeah. I'm looking at them. I'm really looking at them now and saying, they must be kidding, and they said, just send an idea up to the powers that be. And I did. And I got this letter back from them that said, "We have never had a course called The Black Woman. And what books would you use?" I went to my bookshelf and wrote down the name of books, whatever. We sent it back up, and lo and behold, boom, there was a course, called The Black Woman. Can you imagine that? And I couldn't just teach it from the book. I had to look at the book and then at some point take from the book that which I needed, leave the other behind, but also begin to say, how can I reimagine these words? How can I reimagine us at this period, whatever? So therefore these students can see themselves in another light, in another way, in another time, in another place. This is what we understand. This is why we love the people who write these books. This is why we understand that, they are the history makers, just as Dr. Bracy is the history makers, putting everything in perspective for us. And we come with the literature and say, thank you, Dr. Bracy, because at that particular time, this is what happened with the people also too. This is what they began to think. This is what the hatred that began to move into their bones, that traveled from their head down to their toe jam, whatever. This is their reality. Look, we would bring it all together and we began to talk about making a new people, looking a different way at ourselves. Now, I remember when we looked at each other and realized we had come from a meeting and we began to understand that at some point for this Black studies, to last here in the Valley, right, we got to have more than just courses. You know what I mean? Yeah. We've got to have ideology. We've got to show people the necessity of, and above all, we had to show too that not just Black folks and people of color need this, but these white kids coming on this big campus need to understand too, exactly what their parents, what their grandparents did in this place called America, right? And how we've gotten to this point. Graduate studies, whatever. We will live, we will exist, we will survive, and that worked. You all began the work of making that happen, bringing the people in, doing the courses. Someone said to me once, why are you always calling Black people geniuses? And I said, because they is. I said, and also because nobody else calls a Black person a genius. Can you imagine all the geniuses who've been here among us, who called Du Bois a genius? And I was asked on some big program, who was the greatest person on the 20th century? Someone said Einstein, whatever. I was the last person. I said W.B. Du Bois. And everybody looked at me. I said, because nobody did what he did. Most of the people you called out specialized in one thing. This man took everything from the arts to the history, whatever, right? To the social science, whatever, brought it all together in books and said, this is what is going on in America.
Yeah, you can see why Amherst College was not happy to keep your legacy.
But what's interesting about that, I have seen some of those people, but I also have seen the students, and they come up to me and say, a brother who went to Amherst, right? I had him in class, came back home, and I saw him. He came, he found out I was here, and he came and he said, Professor Sanchez, I just want to, I mean, he was being dramatic. He said, I want to get down on my knees and thank you for saving me. One of the things I did up at Amherst is I experimented with a lot, like things like I would do independent studies, but I would end up having 20 people in my independent studies, and they were all pre-med. So what did I do with them? They all knew what they wanted to do and specialize in. And I made them go and study alternative medicine. When my students did their thesis, they knew, well, I only have to do 30 pages. So I said, no, you're a Black student at Amherst College. You have got to do from 90 to 100 pages on your thesis. They would look at me like I was insane. I said, I'm not insane, but you don't understand what we are trying to show in this place called Amherst College, whatever, and because they're trying to show that you don't belong here. And we're saying, oh, sucker, yes, we do. Look at what we produce. And they produce this, and that is always the joy, the amazing joy that I felt being there. But also, I also felt the protection that came from the University of Mass, because they understood many times, that I was struggling, not with my students, right? But I was struggling with the whole idea of paternity, the people who think they gave birth, to me, if you understand that. But the point is simply that I knew what I wanted to do, but I knew also too, I would put a word out to Professor Bracy and say, come on over, we're having a big meeting, and it'll be good for them to hear the voice coming from a university that is, halfway sane. Universities aren't really sane, but halfway sane, and perhaps has a more advanced thing. But we did some amazing things up there. One of the things that we did at Amherst College is that my students saw what was happening over at UMass, Max Roach being there, Archie Shepp and others, whatever. They said, could we have some people also? So I pulled some musicians. They didn't want to do it full time. They wanted to do it, part time. So I had 2 part-time people come in and taught, music to them. Also, taught them about jazz, Black classical music, right? Taught them about notes, had performances with them. That was the joy. In 1966, right?
Yeah.
I go in and the chairperson is there, and I said, I introduced myself or whatever. And, he's saying, the problem with hiring women, is that they have babies. Isn't that something? I mean, that was actually said to me.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
my brain said, well, you signed the contract, so I don't think they can fire you, right? Right? Because I was going to respond. I come from New York. I had a response for that man, right? For that chairperson. And I said, I said, he said, I have a wife. And so, she takes care of the baby. So I said, you're saying I need a wife, huh? And I turned around and left. I met him, I was there early enough for what they call the little parties and the little things they gave, the introductions for the students. And Gerald Penny came up to me. He was from Louisiana, New Orleans, and he said, Professor Sanchez, my name is Gerald Penny, but I'm worth much more than a penny. Ha 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 ha. And I thought inwardly, how corny, right? But you couldn't say that out loud, right? So I nodded my head, oh yes, most certainly, that is so true, right? And I thought, I'll get him someplace along the, a couple, a year from now, whatever, in a class. And I was cooking, and I remember my babysitter had not left as yet. She was staying for dinner, and I was cooking, and the doorbell rang, and I went to the door, and there were 3 students standing there from Amherst College. And they had tears in their eyes and said, Professor Sanchez, what do we do? We don't know what to do. Gerald Penny drowned in the pool. So I got my key and everything, and I asked their sister, would she just eat dinner with the children, and could she stay until I got back? And I would call her, and she did. She was a student from Mount Holyoke. And I still know Sister Joyce, she would babysit for me from Mount Holyoke. And I went out, and we got there, and there he was, stretched out, on that cold, cold floor. And I told them to get some towels for me. And I dried him off, and I said, let's move him and take him off this cold floor, and we did that. And then we went over and we talked to the president, whatever. And I was asked, would I make the call to the parents? I should never forget it. And I said, You want me? Yes. Would you make a call? And I thought, don't argue this, Sonia. So we came back with my students. Many of the other Black students had gathered, and we came back to my office, and I dialed the phone and I hung up before it rang. I looked at the number, I dialed again, and it rang once, and I hung up again. And I remember putting my head down, thinking, how do you tell a parent you send your child at 17 to college and he's dead before, when the classes have just begun? And I dialed again, and the telephone rang, and I picked up, and it was a little child. And I said, hello, is your mommy home? Is your daddy home? And she said, who's this? And I said who I was. And she said, yes. I said, what's your name? I said, do you have, listen to this selfish woman I was. I said, do you have any more sisters and brothers at home? She said, oh, we have a whole lot of sisters and brothers. And I felt better when I heard that. And I knew I could do the job that I needed to do. And she came to the phone, the mother, and I spoke to her, and I told her, and I heard her cry and scream. And, some years later, I hit New Orleans, and I had that name in my appointment book you carry around. And I had that number, and I called, and I went by to see them and see the mother and some of the other children. And we hugged and talked. I watch people get things in a university, and I said, you can't just say I have it, because after you're graduated, they'll take it back, whatever. So you've got to train people to replace you, who will replace you, and will make sure that this legacy continues, period. Otherwise, people just wait in the background and say, well, they're gone, they won't remember this at all. So now we can just, take that space back. But I also was a protector. Quite often the students from Amherst would get drunk and come walking across the street in the streets to get back to their dorm. And then all of a sudden, some of the Black students thought they could do that, and they ended up in jail. And I'd be knocking on my door from one of the other students, said, Professor Sanchez, wake up, wake up. So I went over to the jail, not far from my house, and told them to release him. He was an Amherst College student, and they released him. And all the way back to the dorm, I said, man, do you know where you are? You have got to understand where you be, whatever, you got to understand you're not these other students here, you're in Amherst College, so you're still a Black student. They would lock your behind up. I say to people, don't follow in the footsteps of those who came before, right? Seek what they sought. I need all of y'all to be careful and stay alive, okay? Because we need, coming out of this pandemic, we need the people not only who can think and who can plan and who can organize, but also begin to talk about how we are going to survive the next 20 years, okay? Because these next 5 to 10 years are going to be rough, all people of color at some point, and progressive people. We really do need to sit down and talk about what we must do to make sure that the people coming behind us still walk, and understand that this is a struggle, a battle, not only for human beings, but for this earth.